For me, it's about understanding that regulation isn't about ticking boxes around the black letter of the law. It's about understanding the basic legal framework and the requirements that are imposed on people to affect their behaviour, and then within the law, looking at ways you can affect that behaviour. And that goes way beyond necessarily the specific legal tools that you have access to. It takes you into a wide range of thinking about information, education, communication campaigns, how you manage relationships with regulated parties to influence their behaviour, with or without recourse to some of the harder tools. One of the other things that often gets talked about is the regulatory toolbox. So you think about a craftsperson with a toolbox. They will look for the right tool to do the right part of the craft they're doing, and they'll be looking for the outcome they're trying to achieve rather than focusing only on the little bit of work they're doing at the time. They'll be seeing it in the context of the bigger picture. If you're talking about academics or authors of regulatory texts, Malcolm Sparrow is an example, and he's a person that has spent his life engaging with regulators across industries around the world, actually. So he brings a lot of rich examples and a lot of focus on regulation being a craft, not a tick box kind of activity, about identifying the most significant problems and dealing with them, and really focusing on a risk-based approach to regulation, looking for outcomes. And one of the things that I was particularly taken by in the early days reading his material was around how regulators demonstrate the progress they're making. And in the system we work in, a lot of it's on counting and its numbers and its output measures and performance metrics and all that kind of stuff. But I was particularly taken by one part of his narrative, which I hope I'm remembering correctly, which was around how you need to prepare to tell stories about changes in state of things, because metrics don't often tell you about the success of regulatory activity. I think for regulatory systems to be effective, they have to be seen as legitimate, particularly by the people they're applied to, because we're way past the idea that if it's a legal requirement, people will do it, and if they don't, you should make them. I don't think our society quite works that way anymore. So the legitimacy of a regulatory regime is it's almost as needing as constant attention as the managing the risk of regulatory capture and regulatory failure, because it won't be successful unless it's supported, unless it's seen as legitimate. So the kind of way I think about it is that I've been in areas where the regulator had lost trust, and there were perceptions about the way the regulator has operated that might or might not have been true, but they were deeply held by the industry being regulated. And climbing out of that is very difficult, and it requires a lot of engagement, a lot of openness, and a lot of thought to build processes and be transparent about them, ways of doing things that can be observed by people so that they can see there is not a biased or casual or predetermined approach to things. The example I'm thinking of here is in an industry that is required to report when things go wrong, not doing that because they fear as soon as you tell the regulator you will be prosecuted, despite the reality that out of whatever the number is, 9,000 things reported a year, maybe 3 people get prosecuted. The myth in the industry was so powerful that the whole kind of regulatory engagement wasn't really trusted. And climbing out of that is a lot around personal engagement, relationship management, good policy process, transparency, and literally walking the talk and demonstrating with things that come up that they are being considered carefully, and sharing information that you might be otherwise a bit reticent to share, trying to find ways to talk about case studies or examples that demonstrate the way things work now compared to how they used to work. So yeah, it's a big challenge. As a regulator, if you focus on just the core tools of regulation in a very impersonal sense, you miss the opportunity to achieve better outcomes, basically. So mostly, I think, if you put the effort into engagement with the parties or the industry that you're regulating, then it opens up the possibility of achieving the things you're trying to achieve in a much more effective way, and really supporting people to make their own decisions in a better way than they might otherwise. It's obviously different if you're in a regime that is perhaps crosses the whole economy and touches on everything. It's very hard to have relationships with everybody. So I'm probably talking mainly about kind of industry or occupational type regulation where you've got, so closed systems are very different to the broader systems in terms of that. I think the challenge with the open systems is that you can't have relationships with everybody, and you don't necessarily know everybody because they're not having to come through your entry gate. And you've got to think about your engagement and activity a little differently, probably. You know, most areas have some form of industry association or group of industry associations or whatever. So yeah, there's always, I think, opportunities. Thinking about being a regulator and, you know, sticking to your knitting and doing something that the law says you should do, or thinking creatively about how you can have a positive impact on whatever you're trying to achieve. An example I would use is work on electricity consumer contracts in consumer affairs. And this would have been in the late 90s, I think it was. And because electricity consumer contracts were perceived as not being very fair to consumers, the Ministry of Consumer Affairs, which primarily had a policy, information, education, advice role, we did a project of identifying what good consumer contract conditions would look like for electricity contracts. And then we gathered up all of the contracts from the electricity retailers at the time and assessed them against the framework. And then we published a league table about the quality of the contracts. And what we saw over not a very long period of time was an improvement in the contracts, because no electricity company wanted to be at the bottom of the league table in the daily newspaper. And to me, that was an example of building on around the kind of mandate or the role of the organisation and doing something that was a little bit creative, a little bit different, that had quite a big impact at the time. The Ministry of Consumer Affairs at the time was very small, 30-odd people, so it came down to really one person did a lot of the work. And from a small, I think it was about a 4 or 5 person consumer policy team at the time. And it wasn't particularly controversial internally, other than it was a little bit of a step into using our position in a way that was a little bit perhaps stronger than had been previously the case. So, yeah, no teeth but resilient gums, you know.